All right, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about gender and language. So let's start off with what exactly does gender mean? Gender, when we're talking about grammar or language learning or languages in general, refers to a categorization system for distinguishing different objects. Usually, this is nouns and also adjectives. And this is a really common thing amongst the languages of the world. So just a smattering, an example of some languages with gender are Spanish, Greek, Russian, Sanskrit, Swahili, Arabic, Hebrew, French, German, and I think even like Finnish has it. Thai, you can argue, also has it. It's an incredibly common thing in the languages of the world. And it's actually English, which might be a little unusual for not having it, especially considering most of the relatives of English do have it. So how do you identify gender? Usually in languages that have gender, all the genders are going to be identifiable by what are called morphemes. A morpheme is basically the smallest part of a language that has meaning. So for example, if we look at Spanish, a word that ends in O is going to be masculine, and a word that ends in A is going to be feminine. One thing to note, however, is that if you look at our other two examples, Russian and Greek, there's a third gender. So they have neuter genders. So in other languages, there can be more than 3 genders even. I think Swahili has like 17. So, yeah. In Spanish, it's pretty easy. Russian and Greek, a little harder. And then there are languages like Swahili with like 17. When we say Indo-European, by the way, because I know you might be looking at the note here and saying, what's Indo-European? Indo-European is just the family of languages that includes Spanish, English, Russian, Greek, Sanskrit, and a bunch of other languages in India and Europe. So let's move along. So what exactly makes a hammer masculine and a table feminine? So if you remember from the beginning of the slideshow, it's just a categorization system of objects. There is nothing about el martillo, the hammer, which makes it masculine, and a table, la mesa, which makes it feminine. And we're going to go over how that works in a second. This is something that often stumps my Spanish students. They go like, how is a table feminine and a martillo, or hammer, how is that masculine? Well, we're going to go over that in a second. So how does a language arrive to a gender system like that in Spanish? Well, it'll vary from language to language. In Swahili and other African languages, they usually classify things on a variety of factors. So if you remember, gender is a categorization system. It does not mean male or female literally. In Swahili, for example, there's an animal gender and a plant gender and a spirits gender and I think there's a people gender too. And, it changes. There's also a foreign word gender. So it depends. So what happened in Spanish? Well, let's look at this. This is a common process that has occurred not just in Spanish, but in a bunch of languages in India, Indo, and in Europe, European. So step 1 is animacy versus inanimacy. This might be a more obvious distinction for us, especially as modern people. There are animate things like animals and people, maybe you could argue plants, and inanimate things, that is tools, rocks, buildings, etc. You get the point. Things that are alive and things that are not alive. Well, the thing is, if you look at animate things that are alive, they tend to be either masculine or feminine. Once again, you might include plants in here, but let's, for simplicity's sake, just say it is about living things that move, that are animated, if you will. So all the animals of the world and all people are either masculine or feminine. All right? For grammar purposes, this is just the way it is. So step 3, the sound of the ending of a noun becomes more important than the ending's meaning. All right, so this means that the sound at the end of a word that would have been signaling a masculine word, that sound becomes more important than the meaning of that sound, meaning masculine. And we're going to go over an example of this in a second. Genders across words shift. All right, once again, we're going to go over this in a second. Step 5, this does not always occur, but often the sounds for one ending merge with another. This is exactly what happened with Spanish, and this is why Spanish doesn't have a neuter gender like Russian or Greek. Step 6, this merges the genders. For example, the Latin masculine and neuter merged into Spanish masculine. So let's take a look at an example of this. All right, so in Latin, the word for balance or equilibrium, if you will, was aequilibrium. That means a neuter noun in Latin. Latin also had neuter nouns. What happened, though, is you will notice if you pay attention to your speech that you don't actually speak the way you write. And sometimes we write things that are not actually spoken. So eventually people stopped saying equilibrium and they said equilibrio. And eventually this turns into the modern Spanish equilibrio. And as you know from our previous, slide, that words that end in O are usually masculine in Spanish. So what started off as a neuter gender word in Latin winds up becoming a masculine word in Spanish. So here we can see, is there anything masculine about balance? No, you can quite reasonably argue that it's quite neuter. It's neither masculine nor feminine. However, because of the ending of the word "u," it sounds like the O, so it turns into a masculine O. So equilibrio, equilibrio, equilibrio. Number can often make things appear different as well. So if we look at our articles in Spanish, right, we have 4 articles or definite articles, if you will. So we have el gato, the cat, los gatos, the cats, la gata, the girl cat, and las gatas, the girl cats. Okay? So as you can see, not only does the ending of the word change, o meaning masculine and a meaning feminine, but you also change the definite article, right? So el gato versus la gata, okay? You don't just change the o, but you have an entirely different word using that in that role. All right, so Spanish is pretty simple. Let's take a look at a more extreme example from Greek. All right, so the word for cat in Greek is actually very similar to the word for cat in Spanish. However, Greek uses what is called a case system. So we have gatos. This means the cat is the subject of the sentence. But if it's a female cat, it's gata. All right. And just like in Spanish, you change the ending. So gatos turns into gati and gata turns into gate. However, if you want to say of the cat, you say gatu. Or if you want to say of the girl cat, it's gatas. All right. And as you can see, the ending of a word, this ending morpheme, if you remember, morpheme means the smallest meaningful unit of the word. This can change depending upon what role that word plays in the sentence in some languages. So in Spanish, this doesn't happen, but I thought it would be useful to include an example from a more complicated language, just so you can see a little bit how gender works around the world. So anyway, that's my presentation for today on gender and language. I hope you got something from this, and I hope you have an excellent day.